Now, I'm betting that most of you have actually heard of at least one of these characters from this list of very popular iconic horror movies I've got here in front of me. Norman Bates from Psycho, 1960, Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, and Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs, 1991. Well, did you know that these characters were all inspired by one man, a serial killer who was responsible for the death of two people, maybe more? Oh, and he also liked to dig up freshly buried corpses of women who resembled his recently deceased mother. He would then take these bodies or body parts back to his farmhouse and start to create a suit of skin that he would wear when he was alone at night in his old, dirty, littered house. The sick, twisted, sickening things that he would do to these women's dead bodies earned him the following nicknames: the grandfather of gore, the Plainfield Ghoul, and the butcher of Plainfield. But if you ask me, all of these horrible nicknames are redundant, because it's his real name that I think is responsible for sending a shiver up so many spines over the years. And his name is Ed Gein. But like always, before we get into the killings and the grave robberies and the sickening things that come later, we first have to go back, before Ed Gein was even born, to 1879 in Wisconsin, when his father, George Gein, was only 3 years of age, the age he became an orphan, after his entire family, his mother, his father and his sister, ventured into town on a four-wheeled wagon pulled by horse and cart. And unfortunately, they never made it into town due to the wagon being engulfed by a ferocious flash flood from the Mississippi River, drowning all three of them. And 3-year-old George Gein was taken in by his grandparents, and when he was in his 20s, he left for the city of La Crosse in Wisconsin. George already had the skills of a blacksmith, but didn't mind trying his hand at any other job that came his way. But wherever George went, bad luck just seemed to follow him. As soon as he found work, it seemed like it wasn't long before he was once again unemployed. Maybe this was part of the reason that he took to drink, to drown his sorrows, as the waters of the Mississippi drowned his family. But at this point in his life, the drink hadn't totally consumed him. He still had a little pride left. He was a quiet man and somewhat respectable, as he pushed down the demons that tried so hard to surface. It was at this point in his life, at the age of 24, that he met his future wife, Augusta, who was part of a hard-working, large family. Now, Augusta obviously saw something appealing in George, and in my opinion, I'm not sure it would have been a physical attraction, as she was absolutely fanatical in her religious beliefs, and she was a very controlling woman. She held herself up on a pedestal, believing that she lived in a world full of immorality. She believed everyone around her was filled with sin, and most women were harlots and instruments of the devil. And when it came to sex, she thought this was an absolutely disgusting act. So you see what I mean when I say that Augusta probably made a strategic move when allowing George Gein to take her hand in marriage. Maybe she saw the weaknesses in George and planned to exploit it. But let me make one thing very clear: George was no victim in this story. Not as such. Both him and Augusta were not exactly good for each other, and in turn did not make great parents. After Augusta and George were married in 1899, it became clear to Augusta that George had a problem with the drink and struggled to provide for his family, and as soon as he found work, he would once again lose it. And this was at a time when it was a man's job to provide, it was a man's job to stand tall and protect his family, and George was failing at every turn. He had become a weak man, pathetic and downtrodden, broken. This was how George felt about himself, and Augusta only fueled the fire of his self-loathing by constantly reminding him of how weak he was, and how lazy he was, and how worthless he was. At times, George would fly into fits of rage and beat Augusta, who would carry on shouting the insults regardless. She hated him. Divorce in her eyes was a sin. It was unthinkable, so the marriage went on. For whatever reason, Augusta decided she wanted children, and on the 17th of January 1902, she gave birth to a baby boy, who she named Henry. I can only assume that Augusta desperately wanted a child, enough to let her broken husband impregnate her. After all, sex in her eyes was a means to an end, a laborious act that had to be performed to allow the arrival of a baby. And roughly around 4 years later, she was blessed with another son, who she named Edward Theodore Gein. But now, with 2 children and George failing to put money on the table, Augusta had to take matters into her own hands. In 1909, Augusta made the decision to open a small grocery shop in La Crosse. George was listed as the owner of the business. She had actually found a way to secure work for her deadbeat husband. After all, he couldn't lose a job if the business was his own. But as time went on, however, Augusta found herself constantly taking the reins and running the store herself, as well as her small family. George simply could not handle the business, and it would seem that George couldn't handle life. And within 2 years, he was actually demoted to clerk in his own shop, whilst Augusta took the role of owner of the grocery store. As Henry and Ed grew older, Augusta would constantly tell her children of the evils of the world, how women are harlots and cannot be trusted, and how sin was around every corner and sex was the ultimate sin. And although masturbation was also a sin, it was the lesser of 2 evils. Although upon researching this case, I did discover that once Augusta may have caught Ed masturbating, and she actually grabbed his testicles and twisted them and made him cry as punishment. That, I believe, wasn't in the book Deviant, but I have heard it from different sources. Yeah, so Augusta was harsh with the children. Love and kindness wasn't exactly the kind of emotions that came from Augusta. Instead, she liked to constantly let the kids know that they were useless and lay harsh words upon them. On one occasion, a young Ed Gein raced home from school to tell his mother about a new friend that he had made that very day. This was a big thing for young Ed, who constantly felt he didn't belong, who would often shy away from other children who found him a little strange. But on this day, Ed had finally made a friend, and he was over the moon. Happiness filled him up. But when he ran in to tell his mother, she quickly shot him down, claiming that the boy's mother, who he had made friends with, was a harlot, a sinful person, and that he must not be friends with such a boy who lives with such sin. And then Augusta's wild outlandish claims and her disgust in her son for even considering being friends with anybody would escalate until she was actually screaming directly into her little boy's face. Over time, young Ed would become more and more enclosed, avoided boys and girls completely at school, and would stand alone in the playground out of fear that his mother would be enraged if he was to make a friend. And in my opinion, this would definitely affect the way that he would interact with people in his later life, the way that he found it hard to actually socialise with people, to be comfortable around people. This is most likely where it all started. It's safe to say that Ed Gein and his brother were brought up in a hostile, controlling home, with a drunken father and a strong-willed, controlling mother, who could not see past her excessive religious beliefs, and everyone were disgraceful sinners in her holier-than-holy eyes. It wasn't long before Augusta sold the grocery business. Perhaps serving the public in a grocery store was too much for Augusta and her judgmental ways. Maybe the thought of living among people who freely disgraced the name of God was starting to take its toll. And the thought of bringing up her young boys in such an environment disgusted her. And maybe, just maybe, this is the reason Augusta took all of the money that she had made over the years in the store and purchased a small farm in 1913. But this was a stepping stone to a bigger farm that she purchased in 1914. The farmhouse stood on 195 acres of land just outside of the town of Plainfield and was perfectly isolated. Now Augusta's family were safe from the evils of the city of La Crosse. The farmhouse was quite a good size, and I want to give you a best description as I can of this house so you can imagine the interior for what comes later. The house was a L-shaped, 2-story white frame building, slightly weathered, and would only get worse as time went on. The house was also lacking electricity and indoor plumbing. If you were to wander around the lower level of the Gein house, you would find a parlour, a kitchen, and 2 bedrooms, whilst upstairs boasted 5 more rooms. There was also a small extension to the property joined to the kitchen. This extension was used as a summer kitchen, a place the family could prepare food when the warmer weather came. It was more or less like a wooden shed which was built onto the end of the house. And as you can probably imagine, Augusta was very proud and insisted on keeping a clean and tidy house. Everything had a place, and the house was her pride and joy. And although it was no stately manor, it was her home, and she worked hard to achieve this for her family, and she would work as hard to make it respectable, clean, and tidy. This is very important information to remember because it shows a very harsh contrast to what is coming up later in the episode. The Gein farm also had a very good sized barn and equipment shed and a chicken coop. And like I said before, this farmhouse was isolated from the town of Plainfield, but this would not have been a great thing for Ed and his brother Henry, living in such a toxic environment away from any kind of social life. And the only reason the children really had to leave the farm was to attend school. But school had become a place of ridicule for little Ed Gein, who would be made a joke out of by the other kids, mainly for the way he looked. You see, he had this fleshy growth on his eyelid that would make his eye seem to droop. But also because Ed seemed, well, a little off, a little strange. This is possibly or most definitely due to his mother's insistence that he not mix with the children. In a way, Ed found himself disconnected from the rest of the school children, and his social abilities were simply non-existent. His classmates started to notice strange things about Ed. He would often laugh out loud to himself at random times, and creepily stare at his female classmates. And he apparently had a few feminine traits and would be picked on constantly by his classmates, which would reduce him to a snot-nosed, weeping mess. And this is something that stayed with him even in his adult life, which we will get into a little later. Unfortunately, in 1940, Ed Gein's father, George Gein, passed away at the age of 66. Augusta lost her husband and the boys lost a father, when in reality it wasn't loss that they felt, but relief. In the years before George's death, he had sank further into the bottle and had become good for nothing, a broken man, his will completely drained. All that remained was contempt and hatred. He was constantly mean-spirited towards his family and wasn't afraid to beat on them whenever he needed someone to blame. So the passing of George Gein was a godsend to the family. At this point, Ed Gein was in his early 30s. He was known by the locals as a quiet man, a little strange, but harmless. And he was always happy to lend a helping hand when needed, and he was particularly good with children, and he would often offer to babysit for people, and they would take him up on the offer. That's right, Ed Gein would actually babysit, which is a truly horrifying prospect now, knowing what he did, how he killed 2 women and how he dug up corpses. It's a horrifying thing to think about, but a lot of people think that these children were possibly somewhat safe. It's hard to say, but a lot of people believe that the children would have been perfectly safe because Ed Gein saw them as his equals, and it wasn't his MO. Killing children wasn't what he did. We'll get into that a little later, but killing children wasn't what he did. So maybe the children would have been safe, but in hindsight, I doubt you would pick him for a babysitter now. So yeah, I think maybe Ed Gein felt at ease talking to children and more comfortable because he fit in better, or maybe he felt he had more of a seniority over them, more superior maybe, compared to how inadequate he felt talking to a man or a woman of his own age, especially women, who at times would often catch Ed Gein staring at them with a creepy grin upon his face. But no one really knew of the dark fantasies that were starting to manifest in the deepest corners of his mind. Dark fantasies that could have been fueled by his taste in books. He liked to read books on certain Nazi atrocities, true crime books about murders, cannibals, and death cults. Everyone just believed he was a little odd, but harmless. Everyone was in for a big surprise. The family farm was not bringing in enough money to sustain the family, and Ed would offer his handyman services, repairing fences, painting a wall, general repairs, and if needed, he would babysit. Ed would do whatever he could to earn a few more coins to bring home to his mother. Augusta was his life. He loved her without question, whilst at the same time he held a little hatred that must have left him feeling conflicted. He would constantly look for words of comfort from his mother, some praise, but she had none to give. She didn't appreciate him at all, and he longed for a little bit of appreciation. But she did love him in her own twisted, sick way, an unhealthy way, a controlling way, and he loved her. There was nothing that he wouldn't do for his mother. Henry Gein, however, Ed's older brother and Augusta's firstborn, didn't quite feel the same way. He had noticed a strange relationship between Augusta and Ed, and didn't feel the same way that Ed felt, and found it all a little bit strange. Ed Gein, as we know, absolutely worshipped his mother. There was nothing he wouldn't do for her, so it came as a shock when Ed learned that his brother did not feel the same way, and questioned the unhealthy bond between Ed and his mother. It was something that Ed had not really noticed in the past, and it took him by surprise to find out that his brother did not also worship the ground Augusta walked on. And it must have come to a shock to Ed when Henry informed him that he planned to leave the farm. On Tuesday, May the 16th, 1944, Henry Gein was found dead. According to Ed, on this particular day, Henry and Ed had been trying to snuff out a fire that had started in some nearby marshland near the home. Whilst fighting the fire, Henry and Ed were separated. A little while later, Ed managed to put out the fire and then went to look for his brother, but failed to do so. He couldn't find him anywhere, and so by this time, the sun was setting and darkness crept in. Ed organised a search party, and eventually Henry was found. His dead body lay upon the burnt ground. And according to the coroner, Henry died of asphyxiation, and there was no foul play suspected. Case closed. There was a lot about the death of Henry Gein that just did not add up. Number one, despite the cause of death being asphyxiation, Henry also had a strange bruise on his head. Number two, the ground he lay upon was all burnt from the fire, but there was not one burn mark on Henry's flesh or on his clothing. Number three, Ed Gein took the search party directly to Henry's dead body. Remember, he had gathered the search party to search for his brother, but he seemed to know exactly where to find Henry's dead body. And it was actually brought to Ed's attention by members of the search party how bizarre it was that he had led them directly to Henry's body. But Ed simply replied, funny how that works. And that was that. It would seem that no one in a million years would ever have suspected, or suspected for very long, that this strange little man, this town weirdo, could ever hurt anyone, let alone kill his own brother. But in hindsight, it is very possible that Ed Gein did actually kill his own brother, although it is something that he always denied. So after the death of George Gein and now Henry Gein, now Ed and his mother were alone, and that was just perfect for Ed. As far as he was concerned, now he had her all to himself. Augusta, as you can imagine, was devastated after losing her son, and it was not long before she suffered a stroke, which may have been brought on by this horrible news. Augusta was hospitalized for a time before Ed was allowed to bring her home and care for her in his own way. But Augusta was no longer the woman she once was. She was frail and unable to run the farm, as she would have in full health. So Ed had some extra duties. Augusta would direct him best she could, tell him what needed doing around the house and the farm, and Ed would do them, and then return to her bedside and read passages from the Bible to his mother. Ed was there for her and tended to her every need, and he absolutely loved it. There was nothing he would not do for his mother, who in turn showed not one single hint of gratitude to her son. Over time, Augusta found the strength to walk once again as her strength returned, but she was not the same woman she once was. In the winter of 1945, Augusta insisted that Ed take her to their neighbour named Smith, where they could buy some hay for the animals to see them through the cold months. She insisted she came to overlook the transaction. Obviously, she didn't trust that Ed could deal with the purchase alone. As they pulled up on the Smith property, they witnessed something truly horrendous. Mr. Smith was beating a puppy to death with a stick, brutally bringing the stick down with tremendous force, as a yelping pup lay twitching at his feet. A woman that Smith lived with came out begging him to stop, pleading whilst Augusta did the same. But it was no good. Smith continued until the pup was dead, as the woman by Smith's side continued to hysterically scream and cry. And Augusta was very badly shaken. It had taken it out of her, and she was disgusted to her bones. She couldn't accept what she had just seen. And I'm not talking about the death of a puppy, although it was not pleasant to watch. The real sin that Augusta had witnessed here today was that Mr. Smith had allowed a woman to live under the same roof, and they were not man and wife. The sight of this harlot, as Augusta would have referred to her, was far worse than the murder of a defenseless puppy. Less than a week later, on December the 29th, 1945, Augusta suffered her second and final stroke and died at 67 years of age. Augusta's funeral was a sorry affair, with only a few siblings turning up, and of course Ed Gein, who stood over her grave, sobbing uncontrollably, with snot flowing from his nose, just as it had done so many years ago on the school playground. Ed Gein had lost his world, the only thing that mattered to him, the purest, most righteous woman, and to Ed, she was perfect, and now she was simply gone, and he was alone, utterly alone. Eddie now returned home to an empty house, a house that over time would quickly turn from the tidy, respectable home that Augusta liked to keep into an unkept, disgusting rubbish heap. The house would literally start to fall apart, or maybe a more fitting word would be decay, as Ed prowled the dark rooms alone with no purpose. Although he wasn't always alone. On some nights he would hear the ghostly voice of his dead mother talk to him, urging him to be good, as he looked through the local obituaries, trying to find out who would be buried next in the local cemetery, and maybe under the light of the moon,
Augusta's death,
he might pay them a
personal
visit.
hygiene did not really concern him anymore. He would be seen in the same clothing with the same deer hunter's cap on, and he had this kind of pungent smell that offended anyone's nostrils who came too close. Just as he let go of the upkeep of the house and his land, he also let go of himself just a little. Although his manners stayed intact, that's one thing that always pops up in various Ed Gein documentaries and books. He was a strange man, but he was very polite and shy. In many ways, he was seen as a local idiot, a weirdo, but polite, and always happy to help out. If anyone ever needed a lift or some manual labour, Eddie was your man. He was hardworking and dependable. And like I said before, he was often trusted to babysit because people thought that Ed Gein was harmless. But he was targeted by people who wanted to play cruel jokes on him from time to time, make fun of him and put him down. And I think women would sometimes take pity on him, but they also seemed to be slightly creeped out by Ed. Some women would often notice that his stare seemed to linger a little too long, but at the same time, like I said, they pitied Ed. You see, what people didn't realise was that since his mother's death, his mental health had seriously taken a nosedive, and whatever kind of sanity he clung onto in the past had now simply gone. From 1950 onwards, he became a recluse for most of the time. Not a total recluse, but he did spend his days and nights in his old farmhouse that had been renamed the Haunted House by the children of Plainfield, who had spotted a couple of shrunken heads whilst peering through Ed Gein's window. But Ed Gein played this off by telling the kids that they were actual shrunken heads sent to him by his cousin who was in World War II in the Philippines. And of course, when the children actually mentioned this to the parents just simply told the children that it must be Halloween decorations. So yeah, for reasons that will become apparent a little bit later in this episode, Ed liked to stay at home a lot more than usual. But there were a few places that Ed liked to hang around at. And one of these places was a roadside tavern in the town of Pine Grove. This was around 7 miles away from Plainfield, but Ed did not mind travelling all this way. But it wasn't for the atmosphere of this modest establishment, and it was not for a cold, crisp beer. Eddie had become infatuated with the owner, Murray Hogan, who in many ways was much like Eddie's mother, Augusta. There was a resemblance, accompanied by a German accent. But unlike Augusta, who in Eddie's mind was as pure can be, Murray Hogan was not, or at least I should say she wasn't in Eddie's eyes. According to rumour, Murray Hogan may have been twice divorced. She may have also had connections to the mob,
and it is said that in her past she was a big city madam. These are all qualities that Augusta would have absolutely hated, and so did Ed. But nonetheless, Murray did remind him of his mother, but she also reminded him of everything his mother hated, and this was not a good combination to exist in Eddie's troubled mind. On December the 8th, 1954, Seymour Lester, a local farmer, stepped into Murray Hogan's tavern to find it empty and deadly quiet. But what was even more alarming was a thick pool of blood on the floor that we now know belonged to Murray Hogan. The police were contacted immediately, and once they turned up, the investigation started. What they did find was a used .32 caliber cartridge, and this was found near the pool of blood on the floor. The blood was also streaked across the floor, where Murray was dragged through the door and into the parking area. And then the blood trail just stopped, and it was at this point that it became obvious that Murray's body had been loaded into a vehicle. For many years, Murray Hogan's disappearance was a mystery. Everyone had a theory about her demise. Was it her connections to the mob, or was it something closer to home? The theories were plentiful, but no one in their wildest dreams would ever have imagined that it was actually harmless Eddie Gein who shot Murray Hogan in the head and took a corpse back to his lonely farmhouse. And in fact, Eddie was kind of hiding in plain sight. He was kind of hiding his secret in plain sight. Because on more than one occasion, when Eddie was involved in conversations with others about the disappearance of Murray Hogan, Ed Gein would always say the same joke. So, for example, when people were talking about the disappearance of Murray Hogan, Ed Gein would always say, "Murray Hogan's not missing. She's at the farm right now." This is something that he always said. Like I said, he was hiding in plain sight. He was actually admitting it to people, and they just didn't see how demented this guy was. They didn't see it. And they just thought it was a little bit strange that he'd say something like that, but that's just what Ed Gein was like. And once again, everyone just thought he was harmless. Now we fast forward just a little bit to 1957, and this was the year that Ed Gein took his final victim, and that victim was Bernice Warden. Now, to be precise, it was November the 16th, 1957, and on this particular day, Plainfield will be somewhat deserted. You see, it was the first day of the deer hunting season, and most men would venture into the forest armed with their guns to hunt. It was a cold day, 3 inches of snow lay thick on the ground, and this would make the hunt slightly more difficult, but it did not seem to stop the locals from going and participating. And 3 inches of snow would not stop Ed Gein from going on his own hunt. But Ed wasn't out hunting deer. His prey was actually stood behind the counter of Warden's hardware store. 58-year-old Bernice Warden was the owner of Warden's Hardware. Now, Warden's Hardware was the main store in town where you would find household appliances, farming tools and such, as well as it being a freight depot and a telegraph office. She had a good reputation in town, and she was a keen Methodist, and she was a capable businesswoman, but she did not run the business alone. She had the help of her son, Frank Warden, who was also the deputy sheriff. Unfortunately, on this particular day, Frank was in the woods hunting deer along with many other Plainfield residents, and Eddie knew this as he entered Warden's hardware store holding an empty glass jug that he asked Bernice to fill with antifreeze. Eddie's appearance at Warden's Hardware that particular day was by no accident. You see, Ed knew far too well that Bernice would be alone. He had actually been hanging out a lot at the store recently, becoming somewhat of an annoyance, even going as far as to actually asking Bernice out on a date to go roller skating with him. And in fact, it was only the day before that Ed had been in the store talking to Frank Warden, Bernice's son, asking him if he would be hunting deer the following day. And Frank Warden confirmed that he would indeed be hunting deer, meaning that Bernice would be alone. And satisfied with his answer, Ed Gein inquired about the price of antifreeze and then left the store. So it's safe to say that Ed Gein did his homework before he decided to strike. And Bernice took the glass jug from Eddie's hands and filled it up with antifreeze. Eddie paid, and he left the store. Moments later, Ed returned. Now, Bernice also sold rifles upon the wall, lined up in a gun rack. Now, Eddie asked Bernice if he could actually look at the Marlon rifle that she had on display, and of course, she allowed him to examine the rifle.
As Eddie held the gun in his hands, Bernice walked towards the store window and looked outside. At the same time, Eddie took a .22 shell from his pocket and loaded the rifle. And Bernice was totally unaware that Eddie was actually loading the gun behind her. You see, she'd actually spotted a red Chevrolet across the road that actually belonged to her son-in-law. And it was at this point that Bernice Warden spoke her last words, which were, "I see Bud has a new car. I do not like Chevrolets." As Bernice finished what she had to say, Eddie pulled the trigger, shooting Mrs. Warden in the back of the head. Eddie then loaded Bernice's dead body into the Warden's hardware truck, and then he actually took the cash register. Now this gives you a little bit of insight into what was going on inside of Ed Gein's mind, or more to the point, what the hell was going on in Ed Gein's mind, because he simply didn't take the cash register for the money, and he also didn't do it to make the crime scene look like a robbery. He did it because he wanted to know how the cash machine works. So he just murdered a woman in cold blood, and the next thing on his mind was, I wonder how the cash register works. Maybe I should take that with me and examine it at home. That's the way his mind works. He just murdered someone, and this was the next thing on his mind. So, with Bernice's body now loaded into the hardware truck, he locked up the store and drove out of town. And then when he had gone a further distance from town, he parked the truck out of sight on the side of the road, and then returned back into town on foot to collect his own car. He then drove back to the truck, pulled Bernice Warden's corpse from the truck and put her in his own car, and then he also took the cash register because, let's not forget, he wants to see how that works. That is something that is important to him. And then he raced back to his farmhouse. And he was very eager to get back because he had plans for the corpse of Bernice Warden, and they were not pleasant. They were not pleasant at all. Around 5 o'clock in the evening, Frank Warden, Bernice's son, arrived back from hunting empty-handed to find the door of his mother's store locked, which was very strange because, as far as Frank was aware, his mother intended to remain open. Not only that, the owner of the gas station across the street asked Frank if his mother had decided to go hunting, as he saw her truck leave early on in the day and not return. Also, the lights were still on inside the store. This wasn't like Bernice not to turn off the lights if she was actually leaving. And so, a little concerned, Frank returned home and picked up his own spare key for the store. Upon his return, he slipped the key into the lock and pushed the door open. First of all, Frank noticed that the cash register was missing, and then he noticed the smeared blood stains on the floor that trailed off towards the back door. And there was a lot of blood. Some believe that Ed Gein may have actually slit Mrs. Warden's throat after shooting her in the head, due to just how much blood there actually was on the floor. Now, like I said before, Frank was a deputy sheriff, and I have no doubt that Frank probably knew that something very bad had happened to his mother, but he remained cool and collected. Well, as cool and collected as you can remain when you fear that your mother is dead. But he did. He kept somewhat cool and collected, and he rang up the sheriff. Now, as soon as Frank hung up the phone, he actually started looking around the store for clues to find out who could have took his mother. And he noticed a scrap of paper on the floor, and when he picked it up, he realised it was a receipt for antifreeze. And he knew immediately who had his mother. He just knew, because if you remember the previous day, Ed Gein was actually in the store inquiring about antifreeze just after he had inquired whether Frank would be hunting that day. It all became blindingly clear all of a sudden, and Frank knew exactly who had took his mother. So when the sheriff did arrive with his chief deputy Arnie Fritz, Frank wasted no time and informed them that it was Ed Gein who had his mother. Meanwhile, back at the Gein house, Eddie had two visitors, but it was not the police. It was his teen friend Bob Hill and Bob's sister. The Hills had a little trouble, car trouble. The battery had died and they needed Eddie to run them into town for a new one. Eddie agreed to take them into town, but first he needed to clean up a little. His hands were covered in blood. Now he claimed that he was just dressing a deer, a strange thing for Eddie to say, as he did not actually like to hunt deer. And he claimed that he did not like the sight of blood. Little did they know that Ed Gein wasn't actually dressing a deer. He was actually bleeding out Bernice Warden right there in the summer kitchen. A little later, Eddie returned with the new battery, and like I've said before, Eddie was always happy to help, and so he helped them install it. His kindness was rewarded when Irene Hill invited him in for supper.
And on the menu that evening at the Hills house was macaroni and cheese and pork chops and pickles, and for dessert, coffee and cookies, which to Eddie was a whole lot better than a can of pork and beans, his usual meal that he would eat from the tin and then just discard it onto his dirty littered floor. It was not long after supper that Irene's son-in-law came bursting through the door and informed everyone of Bernice Warden's disappearance. At once, Bob Hill was keen to go down to Warden's hardware store and asked Ed to drive him to take a closer look at what was unfolding. And once again, Ed Gein was always happy to help, and he agreed to take Bob Hill back to the scene of his own crime. Bob Hill and Ed Gein sat in the car for a while on the drive, waiting for the engine to warm up. But before they could actually leave, there was a knock at the driver's side window. Ed wound down the window to be greeted by two police officers. One of the officers, Officer Chase, told Eddie that he needed to talk to him and asked him to step out of his vehicle and accompany him back to his squad car. Eddie sat in the back seat with one of the other officers, whilst Chase sat in the front seat. Chase then turned around and asked Eddie to tell him step by step what he had done on that day. And Eddie did not object. And then Eddie went on telling the police officers about his day, including the visit to the hardware store, but of course excluding the part where he shot Bernice Warden in the head. Officer Chase then asked him to go over it one more time, this time starting with his visit to the Warden store. Eddie once again told his story, and when Eddie had finished there was an uncomfortable silence, and Chase squinted at Gein and told him that his second account of what he had been up to that day was different from the first. And possibly a little bit panicked by this, Ed Gein just blurted out that somebody had framed him. And in response, Chase asked Eddie, "Framed you for what?" And then Eddie responded, "Well, Mrs. Warden." And then Chase asked, "What about Mrs. Warden?" To which Eddie responded, "Well, she's dead, ain't she?" Now, it was at this point that Chase knew he had his man. No one at this point knew what had actually happened. Word had spread that Bernice had disappeared, but no one suspected murder. Well, at least none of the public suspected murder. And little did they know what was waiting for them when they actually pulled up at the House of Horrors, Ed Gein's farmhouse. It was after 8 o'clock when two officers arrived at the Gein house. It was a dark night and snow still clung to the ground. The Gein house stood in darkness. There was no electricity in the old dilapidated house, so the officers proceeded with caution, armed with only flashlights. The police officers found that the house was completely locked up, apart from the summer kitchen, which was attached to the side of the house. The two officers entered the summer kitchen, flashlights sweeping the environment as they stepped over multiple pieces of junk and tools. One of the officers took a step back, shining his light elsewhere when he felt something brush up against his back. The police officer turned and shined his beam of light upon the mutilated body of a female hanging from her feet. A sharpened wooden crossbar had been forced through the tendons of her ankles. Another piece of rope ran from the crossbar above to her arms, which were tied tightly by her side. The front of the woman's body had been completely split down the centre, leaving a gaping void that glistened in the torchlight. And as the officer looked lower down, it was clear to see that the head had been cut away from the neck and was nowhere to be seen. The officer froze for a second, trying to figure out exactly what it is he was looking at. At first he thought he was looking at a deer, but then it became blindingly obvious that he was actually looking at the mutilated body of a woman, and he dashed from the shed. He fell to his hands and knees and vomited right there into the snow. Bernice Warden had been found. It was not long before more officers arrived at Ed Gein's farmhouse, including country lawmen, state troopers and investigators. The sight of Bernice Warden's hung, mutilated body was a shock to the system, to say the least. Little did they know what actually waited for them inside Ed Gein's actual home. The officers entered the old dark house to find it was a complete pigsty. Actually, Ed Gein's house made a pigsty look quite good. The rooms were filled with garbage, which included old dirty magazines, old musical instruments, used rusty tins, decomposing scraps of food, bottles, tools, and even a can of used chewing gum, like a proud collection that he just needed to keep, and so much more random items that belonged in the trash. In fact, it was almost as though trash had actually been emptied into the house. It was that cluttered. It was most definitely not the well-kept house Augusta had been so proud of while she was in the world of the living. As the officers searched the house with only their flashlights to illuminate the chaos, they discovered more and more disgusting and strange items such as yellow dentures that were on display and a sink full of sand. One officer noticed a strange-looking bowl sitting upon the kitchen table, but something was off about it. It looked like it had a strange design. The officer held it up into the light, and he quickly realised that it was actually holding the top of a human skull sawed off around the jawbone to resemble a bowl. But it wasn't the only bowl Eddie had fashioned out of human skulls. There were a few more here and there around the house. And there was also a few untouched skulls that were still whole, two of which were stuck on the end of Ed's bedposts like Halloween decorations. They also found chairs around the kitchen table, and I know what you're thinking, there's nothing unusual about that. Well, these chairs had been upholstered using human skin, pulled tight, and if that was not gross enough, the underside of the skin had greasy lumps of fat clinging to it. It was quickly becoming clear that Bernice Warden was not the only woman Ed brought home over the years. He had been a busy little bachelor. The officers knew that they could not continue the search with flashlights, and it was not long before floodlights were brought into Ed's house, literally flooding the rooms with light. And now came the gruesome task of searching for more body parts. And they discovered more of Ed's inventive uses for human skin, such as a lampshade which was totally made out of human skin, and a waste paper basket which was also made out of human skin. The amount of gruesome things they found was unbelievable. This was like nothing ever seen before, and I would possibly say nothing ever seen since. But it wasn't only household furniture Eddie had been making out of people's bodies. He also had made himself certain outfits made from skin. This included a corset made from a female torso, skin from the shoulders down to the waist. He'd also threaded cord through the flesh to pull it tight around his own body. He'd also made himself a pair of leggings made from a female's leg skin. The mystery of the disappearance of Mary Hogan was at last solved when one of the officers found her face in a bag. Yeah, her face. Eddie had carefully peeled it from her skull, and he'd made his own gruesome face mask, and it wasn't the only one that he had made. In fact, they found Eddie had a few, 9 in fact, and the hair was still intact, with holes where the eyes should be. The police officers also found a shoebox containing 9 vulva, some including the anus, and it was later discovered that Eddie liked to wear these over his own genitalia. Some he had tried to preserve by using salt, and one particular one he had actually tried to preserve by painting it silver. The police officers also found a belt that Ed had fashioned from female human nipples. Allow me to just list off the rest of the totally disgusting items that they found in Ed Gein's home. They found whole human bones and fragments, Mary Hogan's skull, a young girl's dress, and 2 vulvas said to be from a teen, 4 noses, a pair of lips that were attached to a window shade, and apparently when the shades were closed, the lips came together to form a kiss, a lampshade made from the skin of a human face, fingernails, and he had also designed a human female nipple doorbell. And you're probably wondering where was Bernice Warden's head. Well, they actually found that in a sack that had been placed between 2 dirty mattresses. They also found Bernice Warden's heart in a bag next to the stove. Now, some reports say that it was found in a frying pan, sparking the rumour that Ed Gein was a cannibal, which, after everything that came to light, would not be an unreasonable assumption to believe that Ed Gein ate his victims, but apparently he didn't. But bear in mind, we are only taking Ed Gein's word for this. He claimed that he never ate any of his victims. But who's to say that he did or he didn't? Some people do believe that he may have eaten some of his victims, and some people don't. Back at the police station, Ed was insistent for quite a while that he had been framed. But after a long amount of time and a long amount of interrogation, he actually caved. Upon interrogating Ed, he informed the authorities that he had killed Mary Hogan but had no memory of doing so, and he claimed that Bernice Warden's death was an accident, but the rest of the body parts that were found around the house were from a few different cemeteries.
He claimed that he would go to the graveyard under the veil of darkness and dig down to the freshly buried corpses that he read about in the papers. He would open one side of the coffin and slip the body out and take it home. The police did not initially believe that little Eddie Gein had the strength to do such a thing and that he was telling lies. So Ed gave them names of the corpses that he took, and upon digging up one of these coffins, they found it to be empty, apart from Eddie's crowbar that he left behind. They also dug up 2 more coffins just to be certain. One of the other coffins contained just certain body parts, like Eddie had just took what he needed, or possibly brought body parts back, and then the third coffin contained absolutely nothing. It became clear that Eddie was telling the truth, that between 1947 and 1957 he had made many nighttime trips to the graveyard to dig up bodies or just take the pieces that he wanted. Ed said that most of the time when he was making these trips to the graveyard, he was doing it under a dazed-like state, like he was in a haze. Apparently, sometimes he wouldn't even remember. For example, he had no memory of killing Murray Hogan. He also said that on one occasion, he seemed to snap back to whatever reality he lived in, and he would feel guilt and shame, and that he would return certain body parts that he didn't need to the graveyard, and on other occasions, he would simply walk away empty-handed. All in all, Ed admitted to stealing from 9 graves, and it was strange how some of the dead women all resembled his mother in some way, shape or form. It's believed that Ed missed his mother so much that he wanted to become her, hence making the skin suits and face masks from various corpses. He literally wanted to become his mother. And Ed did also claim that he tried to dig up his mother, but he couldn't actually get down to the coffin. It proved too hard for him for some reason. This particular grave was just out of his reach. Eddie was also asked if he had had sex with the dead when he brought them home, and he denied ever having any kind of sexual contact with the corpses. And get this, he claimed that they just smelled too bad. Now, as we know, upon the initial search of Ed Gein's house, the investigators found some truly awful things. The chairs made out of skin, the lamps made out of skin, the soup bowls made out of human skulls, the skin suits. They found some awful things, but imagine what they thought when they discovered a room that was actually boarded up. What horrors awaited them on the other side of this barricaded door? A door that Ed Gein did not want anyone to see what was behind. I can only imagine that the investigators were thinking, what the hell can be behind this door that is worse than what we have already found in this house of horrors? What could possibly be barricaded behind this door? And I can only imagine as they pulled away the wood and opened the door that they dreaded what they might find on the other side. And as disturbing as a lamp made from a human face or a skin corset actually is, I think what they actually found when they opened this door was even more haunting. Behind the boarded doors was a bedroom and a parlour in absolute immaculate condition. Everything was in its place, everything was tidy, the bed and the furniture all immaculate. It was in some ways bizarre and a little creepy that the boarded up rooms were so preserved in contrast to the rest of the house, which was in a state of absolute disrepair and cluttered, not to mention the skull balls and the nipple belts and the skin suits and so on. The rooms that Eddie had preserved so well did show one sign that they had been untouched since Augusta's death many years ago, and that was the dust that covered the surfaces of the furniture, just as the snow covered the ground outside. Upon searching the room, the investigators found neatly folded clothing placed in the bedroom drawers, and this neatly folded clothing all belonged to Ed Gein's mother, Augusta. And now it was also clear these rooms belonged to Ed's mother, Augusta, and they lay exactly how they had been when she had passed away. Eddie felt the need to board these rooms up and keep them perfect for his mother, a perfect dwelling place for a ghost, whilst the rest of the house became a nightmarish place to live.
After the house was cleared of all Ed's gruesome items, there was a rumour that the house was going up for sale, and one interested buyer wished to cash in on the house and turn it into a horror museum, charging people to look around Ed Gein's house. But the people of Plainfield were understandably horrified by this idea. The problem was Plainfield would now forever be associated with Ed Gein and the murders and the House of Horrors, and it is safe to say to this very day it still is. But even in the early years, as the news spread, Plainfield saw strange faces turning up to view the Gein house, and the hardware store where Bernice Warden was killed, as well as the constant barrage of the press. And the people of Plainfield absolutely hated this. They didn't want their little town to be forever associated with a serial killer, and they most definitely did not want the house to be made into a horror museum. In March of 1958, Ed Gein's house burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances. No one knows who lit the match, who actually started the fire, but it is speculated that it was a handiwork of the people of Plainfield, who did not want to see their place on the map forever associated with Ed Gein. It didn't work. Although the house did not survive, Ed Gein's car, the same car that he loaded up Bernice Warden's body in and Mary Hogan's, and not to mention the multiple dead bodies that he dug up from the graveyard, sold. The maroon 1949 Ford sedan was sold in an auction for $760, which is close to $8,000 in today's money. The man who purchased the car was a Mr. Bunny Gibbons, a carnival sideshow operator. Gibbons would charge people to view the car at different county fairs around the state. He even went as far as to place life-size dolls that represented Ed Gein and Bernice Warden into what he morbidly named Ed Gein's Ghoul Car, with advertisements that read, "See the car that hauled the dead from their graves," and the Plainfield, Wisconsin crime that shocked the nation in 1957. That's right, for 25 cents you could gaze upon Ed Gein's car, and for the first 3 days, over 2,000 people paid their fee and entered the tent where the car was kept. But as you can imagine, many people thought this was in bad taste, and it wasn't long before the exhibition was banned by the state, and Gibbons retired Ed Gein's Ghoul Car, and to this day, no one knows what became of the 1949 maroon Ford sedan. But we do know what became of old Ed Gein. After Gein was arrested, his lawyer entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, and Gein was found unfit to stand trial after being diagnosed with schizophrenia and was committed to the Central State Hospital in Waupun. In 1968, Ed Gein was finally fit to stand trial and was found guilty for Warden's murder, but at the same time he was also found insane when the murder took place, and so Ed Gein was once again committed to Central State Hospital. In 1974, Gein petitioned for an early release. It was rejected. Over the years whilst incarcerated, it was said that Ed Gein settled into his life at Central State Hospital well. He was as polite as ever, never any trouble at all, and made himself useful, taking on roles such as the mason, the carpenter's assistant, and the medical aide. It was said that although insane, being caught kind of set him free of his demons, and he found some kind of peace in his own sick, demented mind. After all, his life had been one of loneliness, in a way always being the target for a cruel joke, and the feeling of never really being accepted, no thanks to the abuse from his overbearing mother that had turned him into this monster. On July the 26th, 1984, Ed Gein took his last breath at the age of 77. He died of lung cancer. He was buried alongside his family in Plainfield, only a few meters away from some of the graves that he exhumed and plundered. You won't find a headstone for Ed Gein after it was stolen in the year 2000. It was recovered in Seattle, but it has been decided not to place it back over Ed's plot and instead was placed into storage. Now, before we end today's episode, I just want to read you a poem that surfaced not long after the killings. Now, the writer of this poem is now unfortunately lost to time. No one knows who actually wrote this poem. And even though it is in poor taste and it is kind of gross and sickening, I must admit it is impressive and I kind of like it. It's a kind of parody of Clement Moore's A Visit from St. Nick. And it goes like this. 'Twas the night before Christmas when all through the shed all creatures were stirring, even old Ed. The bodies were hung from the rafters above, while Eddie was searching for another new love. He went to Watoma for a Plainfield deal, looking for love and also a meal, when what to his hungry eyes should appear but old Mary Hogan in her new red brassiere. Her eyes how they twinkled ever so gay, and her dimples, oh how merry were they. Her cheeks were like roses when kissed by the sun, and she let out a scream at the sight of Ed's gun. Old Ed pulled the trigger and Mary fell dead. He took his old axe and cut off her head. He then took his hacksaw and cut her in two, one half for hamburger, the other for stew, and laying a hand aside of her heel, up to the rafters went the next meal. He sprang to the truck, to the graveyard he flew. The hours were short, and much work must he do. He looked for the grave where the fattest one laid, and started in digging with a shovel and spade. He shovelled and shovelled and shovelled some more, till finally he reached the old coffin door. He took out a crowbar and pried open the box. He was not only clever, but sly as a fox. As he picked up the body and cut off her head, he could tell by the smell that the old girl was dead. He filled in the grave by the moonlight above, and once more old Ed had found a new love. He let out a yell as he drove out of sight. "If I don't get caught, I'll be back tomorrow night."